first cog in our machine is going to be my good friend, longtime close personal friend, Jeff. How are you this evening, man?
I'm doing well, John. Doing well, Josh. Great to be on board.
Yeah. How many? I know from John talking about you a little bit that you have an enthusiasm for Deutschrock or Krautrock, however you want to call it. How much had you listened to this album in prep for our episode tonight?
I had bought this album a few years back, so it had been a little while since I did another take and another listen. So it was kind of just almost like revisiting it back again and just revisiting, just the whole album and the whole experience, which was like, wow, I'm like, there's a reason why I bought this album. And my whole, I think, interest in krautrock actually probably stems from being a David Bowie fan. I know you guys did a few of their albums already, and I'm totally looking forward. I'm hoping that Heroes is on your list. That's probably one of my.
It is.
Yes.
It is. Okay. So that's
Low.
As is Low. So so those three albums, I think, from a rock perspective, I wouldn't really classify myself as a rock guru, but definitely I'm a big David Bowie fan. He's been kind of my the artist that I've kind of used as kind of a way to explore more of rock music, and I'm really into his influences, and so that's how I kind of got into krautrock, and just listening. I don't know if we're going just kind of into the reaction for the songs, but
not just yet. We're gonna introduce
not just
the
yet.
album.
Okay, but that's just kind of the general connection.
Nice.
Can I ask you one question, Jeff? Because this has been a through line of our conversations of Bowie so far. We just did Aladdin Sane a couple weeks ago, so that you kind of get an idea of where we're at with Bowie. So we're not at Diamond Dogs, which actually we're not going to cover, or the Thin White Duke Bowie yet. So we're still coming out of Ziggy, right? But the question that we had in Aladdin Sane, and two of us went one way and one went the other, is, can you listen to Bowie and understand Bowie without understanding his personas, or are the personas impossible to not be a part of the Bowie mystique? Is he can he just be music, or do you have to know him as the full Bowie?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in kind of where you guys are in the discography, I think it's really hard to separate himself from the music. His personas were so much a part of, I think, like the live version of his performances, and he just brought it. And I think just having read a bit about his career and stuff, he always said that he adopted them because he really wasn't kind of comfortable under his own skin. So from my own point of view, I think it's the early on, up through the station to station, it was more just kind of adopting the personas. For me, it's hard to kind of to separate them.
Okay, so now Jeff gave us a little bit of background, and we talked a little Bowie. We're gonna talk. The album that we're talking about tonight is "NEU" by NEU, which is German for new, and it's from 1972. And
you are a rhyming machine.
And the numbers are, according to besteveralbums.com, it is the 20th best album of 1972. It is the 179th best album of the 70s overall, and it is the 804th best album of the top 1,000 albums of all time. So it's in the top 1,000.
Okay.
It's not on the Rolling Stone list and not on that 1,000 albums to listen to before you die list. So let's kick it over to Jeff. And Jeff, what were your fresh thoughts listening to this album again for the first time, quote unquote?
Yeah, I thought my initial take is that it almost sounded like it was almost like a soundtrack, and just knowing that this album came out in the was it early 70s?
Yep.
It almost sounded like I felt like I was like watching like an art film or something like that, with just some of the sound effects. I mean, with the opening track, I think it was it Hallow Gallo?
That's the opening track.
Like, from it just conjured like images like of just like riding on the freeway. Like you're cruising in a car and the engine's kind of like chugging along, and I think it was like that drum beat that was just awesome. It's just like you're kind of like motoring along. You picture like you're
would
like,
it be safe
like
to
being
say
on a motorcycle
on the Autobahn, Jeff? Is that what it conjures in
the
your
Autobahn?
mind?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, the Autobahn, exactly. It's like so that first track, I mean, most of these, they were all like instrumental. That's the other reason why I felt like it was almost like some of these songs were like kind of like almost like science fiction-ish, like these weird, there was this one track that had like kind of that they were like recording underwater or something.
Oh, yeah.
And then I think it might have been like that same track where it had the water sound, and then it had kind of this like squeaking noise that it sounded almost like a bird. So I'm like, is this like a nature song? Like, is this like a track?
It's got that like music concrete, the sounds, the Eno thing, the just finding sounds and mixing them with ambience.
Exactly.
I think I'm
exactly.
Gluck is the song that you were talking about with the water.
With the I am Gluck. And then there's like that banger, I think it was Negative Land. Like that was like badass. Like that was like a Quentin Tarantino type movie. Like, I don't know, for some reason, like movies just kind of come to mind with because of the lack of like kind of lyrics. One of the things I know about this album is I think it's just two guys like in the band, but there's the one connection I kind of had with this album was with the producer Connie Plank. Like, and I'm kind of more of a music fan. I love the like learning about kind of the process of the role of the producer. And I think the producer, like, they don't really play the instruments, but with all those sound effects and stuff, like he was totally like almost like a member of the band because of all of like the droning guitars and stuff like that. Let's really cool.
Let's give a real quick history lesson here for folks. You are absolutely right, Jeff. NEU is a two-piece. It's Michael Rother and Klaus Dinger. They were in Kraftwerk before they joined NEU. Kraftwerk is pretty much the only krautrock band we have not covered yet on the show. We've covered Faust, we've covered CAN, we've now covered NEU. So the fourth and final, and ironically probably the most well-known, is Kraftwerk. But like you said, Jeff, Connie Plank is considered the band's hidden member, or, kind of like George Martin with the Beatles, the fifth Beatle, he's that for NEU. So just a little context there to build off of what you're saying.
Yeah, and like there was a lot going on with all these like different sound effects. I feel like he was like it was interesting because I actually listened to this and I remembered that this producer, this guy Connie Plank, like he had connection to Kraftwerk, like he actually produced their albums as well, and there's just like a very stark difference because he's been involved in both, and Kraftwerk is like super, like I think of Kraftwerk, I just think of like kind of like the electronics and like the drums, everything kind of like the early techno. But this was different because it was more of like that 70s rock version with some of the electronica. I think is the best way to kind of describe it, almost kind of like a hybrid. Definitely more of the drums and the guitar versus like Kraftwerk, which was like just like kind of pure kind of electronic music. So that was my take. I thought it was just like really definitely like experimental. There were some of the tracks like that last song I couldn't really kind of bear with some of the lyrics or something. But there were definitely some really bright moments, and then some that I kind of felt like kind of fast forwarding a bit.
What's the? I totally get that. What's the standout track for you on this album? If you had somebody that wanted to listen to one song, what do you think?
I think it had to be like that Negative Land.
Mm-hmm.
It was totally like it was almost like a collage where it opened up with like the roar, like the barking dogs, and then like a crowd yelling, and then it just goes into like this deep bass and and guitars, and it was just, and then the droning effect like that. It was just like it had like all of kind of like the elements going on with with the instruments, and I think kind of like with like some of the production work. It was a great track.
Nice. John, what did you think about NEU?
Well, of all the krautrock we've done, and I was actually told by many of our German listeners through YouTube and other things that krautrock is, in their mind, politically correct. Okay. So whether they are a small section of it, I don't want to, do the tokenism, right? But it does not seem to be something that is a negative right there. So we could say German rock, but I think krautrock has transcended it into almost like you would say like Nashville country, or even like, even like giving artists from a certain place, Jamaican reggae, or even like traditional black music and stuff. I think it's not so much a negative term as much as it just explains where it's coming from, in this case, Germany. Yep. With that being said, when I listen to this album, by far this is, I wouldn't say it's very rooted in the Western tradition of blues and R&B by any means, but this did dabble into some traditional Western song structure, certainly more than Faust and CAN did, I would say.
I would agree.
There were some, I guess what you'd call for krautrock choruses in that traditional sense. Two things that stood out immediately to me. Boy, can you hear like the clear influence this had on electronic music, right?
Oh,
like
yeah,
when I listened to this, I thought of like, Daft Punk and Primal Scream and a whole bunch of stuff we're going to cover in the 90s, right? And the forerunners of those things. You could hear like the embryonic stage of electronic music in this. And in a different way than other sort of experimental stuff like Zappa and Captain Beefheart and the other, German rock we've done. This one had a little bit more of the backbeats and stuff and rhythms that reminded me of the progression, right? That's number one. The number two thing that I would say is one of the things that I knew knew from reading about the band a little bit. It's not quite a cold listen on this because I did want to do a little homework on this. Is a lot of what's talked about is what's called the Motoric beat, which is a 4x4 rhythm. Yes. And you hear it in krautrock a lot, but boy, like you heard it in this much more, that 4/4 structure. And if you get a chance, if you're not familiar with it, and I don't know how familiar you guys are with it, but you can go on YouTube. That's the wonderful thing about YouTube is you can put in that 4x4 Moderic beat, and you can hear what it sounds like. And once you've heard it, it's hard to unhear it. It's kind of a 4/4 time of moderate pace. The pattern is repeated each bar through the song, and either like a splash or a crash cymbal is often the beginning of it, and you can hear it over and over again. In there, you know what else they said, Josh? One of the ways you can hear it is Mo Tucker from Velvet Underground. He drummed in the 4x4.
Oh, she drummed.
Yeah. Excuse me. Yeah. Big misspeak there.
That makes sense.
Yep.
That may be
but
why I
you know what I mean?
Underground so much.
Especially when you go back to White Heat, White Light, White Heat, you can hear it a lot there. And that album is the most like krautrock, which makes sense.
Yeah.
And boy, the Velvet Underground, I mean, I always knew, but their influence continues to grow as I listen to all these albums. I'm like, shit, in many ways, they're more influential in the early 70s than the Beatles were, aren't they? Because a lot of these bands, my God, the tails off of it. But I actually very much like this album. I wouldn't say it's one of my favorite albums of the decade, but it's by far my favorite German rock album we've done so far. And there was a lot to like. Like a lot of the krautrock albums we have, there are periods that are like a labor and not always a labor of love, but there were more stuff. I really liked the second track, and I apologize to any German listeners as we're speaking, but Sonderbot, I believe, is the name of it. Im Gluck, which we've talked about, I liked, and as Jeff said, Negative Land. All three of those really stood out to me. So I enjoyed this album. Josh, what were your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm right with both of you guys. I really like this album as well. I think is by far the most accessible of the German rock that we've listened to. I agree with Jeff. It really kind of set a kind of mood and scene with the music. I wrote down words like ambient and also kind of hypnotic at times as well. It reminded me of, well, I think Radiohead's a clear influence from this, and I think, and even bands like Yola Tango I heard in this as well. And also when Jeff said it was like a movie, that kind of brings to mind Cliff Martinez, who is a musical score producer maker for movies, and his music is very like electronic based in a lot of movies like Drive, and that kind of reminded me of this as well. When Jeff said driving down or driving and listening to it, that kind of struck a chord with me. I think the standout tracks for me are probably the most accessible ones on this. Hollow Gallow and Negative Land, those are by far my favorites on here. The other ones they're a bit more work, but they're nowhere near like CAN level of homework. And yeah, they do, I guess they do incorporate that 4/4 beat. That's probably why I responded to it so much better than the German bands, and just the incorporation of guitars and not totally like synthesizer focused or bringing in all the other abstract sounds. I mean, the water that's pretty easy to get into in comparison to other things. So I think this is a really good entry point if you're looking to get into German rock.
Yeah, and one thing I'll say before I kick it over to Jeff with a question is, this, unlike a lot of the experimental stuff we've done, doesn't sound like a lot of, and you know, and I don't even mean to minimize this, but this is the origin story for a lot of the experimental stuff. Like, let's do a lot of drugs and just fuck around a little bit. You know, that was kind of White Light, White Heat, Trout Mask Replica, the Faust thing, right? You know, let's buy a house in the middle of nowhere, do a bunch of drugs, and then do stuff, which has its way, you know what I mean? But this was the first thing that didn't sound like it was rooted so much in that sort of spirit. This sounded a little bit more focused, I would say. And in that, I think it was a little bit more like Frank Zappa, who I always felt was a more focused version of avant-garde. And as Jeff mentioned before, it is impossible to hear this without thinking of David Bowie listening to this, either in the moment or a couple years later, and being seduced by it when he was, you know, cleaning up in Germany. Because, holy cow, you know, the footprints of Station to Station in particular are all over this, aren't they? With the lack of lyrics and you know, the instrumental side of Station to Station in particular. So, but we'll get there. Jeff, what do you think?
Yeah,
because you have a pretty good history with all of the krautrock bands. So where, you know, from your context, where does this stand in maybe not just the krautrock bands, Jeff, but also some of the experimental stuff that I know you love, like Roxy Music and Eno and Magazine and Suicide and stuff like that. A bunch of stuff we're going to be getting to later in the decade.
Yeah. I think, you know, I think you mentioned that, you mentioned some of the other contemporary bands that probably have, you know, connection. And yeah, I definitely feel like these guys were kind of like pioneers, and I think it's a great point that you raised. It's like sometimes with some of these bands, like, you know, how much were they under the influence of something? But I think it was very, I don't know, it was very kind of definitely like I felt like it was like artistic, and they kind of had like a, you know, a vision. I think one thing that's interesting is that they broke up from, or they were a part of. They had connection with Kraftwerk. I think they had broken up from them, and so they kind of clearly had their own, these two guys like had their own thought as to their own vision of you know of music and of rock, and it's definitely, they kind of carved their own, because I think when I think of some of the some of the bands of this era, you mentioned like CAN, Kraftwerk, the Faust, and these guys kind of really kind of stood out, on their own as well. And yeah, I just thought it was. I think it's really neat. One of the things, I'm a big like Brian Eno fan, and I think Connie Plank was almost like a predecessor in the sense of using, and I think there's other examples. You guys probably already covered some of these examples, but like almost like a Brian Wilson, where it's the studio is an instrument. And I think I actually saw this documentary on Connie Plank, and it was actually quite depressing, because it was it's on like Amazon Prime. So if the listeners are really interested in more about Connie Plank, it's on Amazon Prime. It's kind of depressing because it's his son. He's kind of basically interviewing all of the artists that his father Connie had recorded throughout his career. I think some of the new band members are in the documentary, but this was a guy who was really dedicated to his craft, and he was, he basically, in his own way, kind of did his own. He was very successful, both like with pop artists. I think he did a lot of groups in like the '80s. I think he did the Eurythmics. I think were kind of the biggest, and like Depeche Mode. But he started early in his career with some of these kind of more kind of experimental bands, and I think through the experimentation, he brought that to the pop artists to kind of help them experiment and try new things. And so it's a fascinating documentary for those if you're interested in learning more. I'm just a big fan of just like kind of producers and stuff like that. So I'm like, I'll just check this out. But I thought it was a cool album.
Yeah, I think that documentary is called Connie Plank: The Potential of Noise. I looked that up while you were talking about it. So people can go check that out. I mean, that makes total sense when you say like Depeche Mode and Eurythmics. You have that 4/4 beat almost in some of their music, and bringing that electronic sound to like dance pop kind of.
Yeah, it's of a synthetic universe to some degree. Yeah. And so much of the other music that we cover in this early 70s is built around the sensual and the emotional, right? We're going to be covering Carly Simon, for Christ's sakes, tonight. You know what I mean? Which couldn't be any less detached from a synthetic environment. And that like in your, we're in that peak moment of singer-songwriters and really visceral rock bands and soul singers that lay it all out there, that it's such a very different vibe, isn't it? To get something like this, which is a dreamscape almost. So really cool.
So it sounds like a big thumbs up from all three of us on this album. And yeah, check it out for sure.
I think so too. And Jeff, I'd like to thank you for swinging by.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
I might have to bring you in as our resident kraut rock avant-garde guru in the future.
Yeah, you're always welcome. You can just now you know how to work it. You'll just jump in at random probably and just